How's it going, everyone? Welcome to my podcast or YouTube show or whatever you want to call it, Wandering with Thenuka, where we have conversations with people that have charted unconventional paths in life. So my first guest was former Citibank manager and current Zen priest Michael McCord. If you haven't seen that, please check that out. And my second guest today is Daniel and Nalesnik. So Daniel was a software engineer that fell in love with learning Mandarin, became fluent, at some point moved to Hong Kong to pursue banking, and then left that to go launch his own Chinese language learning startup, where he designed, coded, and marketed the product all by himself. So there's a couple of interesting things about this particular conversation that I'd like to point out. So first, there's a lot here on learning languages. Why commit to learning a language like Mandarin, especially when it takes probably 10,000 plus hours to become really fluent in it? So you'll hear a lot about how Daniel started, what he did to learn, the challenges he overcame, what he came to appreciate about the philosophy of learning a language and what that did for him. You'll also see kind of how learning Chinese compared to learning things like software engineering for him, or even learning French, which he really disliked. And what are the commonalities and differences between learning these different types of things? The other part of the interview is really about launching HackChinese, which is Daniel's Chinese language learning company. Unlike a lot of founders who are in a really big rush to try and build the biggest thing as quickly as possible and are hiring a lot of folks and raising a lot of money, Daniel took a very different approach. He didn't hire anyone. He had to reteach himself software engineering, had to learn design, and had to learn marketing, and had to basically do all three of these things by himself. So Daniel took what I would call a craftsman's approach to building a software product, which is not something you see very frequently. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. If you want to skip at any point during the video, there are timestamps, so please use those. But aside from that, I really hope you guys enjoy it, and looking forward to seeing what you guys think in the comments below. Daniel, how's it going?
Good. Thenuka, how are you?
I'm good. Okay, so everyone, today, for the first episode of my podcast, which is yet to be named, but will be named at the time I publish it, today we have Daniel Nalesnik. So Daniel has been a friend of mine. Quick bio on Daniel. So he was previously a banker in Hong Kong, working at a very large custodian bank called State Street. He quit that a few years ago to launch his own Chinese language learning startup. He is also worth mentioning at this point, he's fully fluent in Mandarin and is probably one of the most impressive solopreneurs I've ever met in my life. So, put those expectations there. But Daniel, it's great to have you. And yeah, how are you doing?
Great. Thanks for having me on, Thenuka. This is such an opportunity to speak with you and whoever else is interested in this stuff. So thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Daniel, so part of the reason I wanted to chat with you is because you have a really, to me, a really unusual background story. So we'll get into a lot of this throughout the course of the interview, but as I understand it, so you studied computer science in university, you became a financial software engineer. After that, you, at some point in there, you started studying Mandarin and developed an interest in that. Became fluent, moved to Hong Kong, left, started your own Chinese language learning startup. Now you've been an entrepreneur for a little while. So there's a lot of things in here that are pretty interesting to me, including kind of the combination of skills you decided to develop, the language skills, the changes of location you've made throughout the course of your career. So kind of taking it back to the beginning, kind of tell us about your journey to university, why you decided to study computer science, how you found that, because I think that's kind of the first point there that leads into all the other interesting stuff that comes afterwards.
Okay, cool. From a very young age, I was very interested in computers and coding. I think my first coding language was QBasic in maybe 6th grade or 8th grade, was making small text games, something like that. This was even really the beginnings of the internet, so I found tutorials online when there was no YouTube or anything. Really enjoyed computers and the net back in the day was one of my favorite movies. Obviously, The Matrix, all that type of stuff. Was very into that. So for me, computer science was obvious natural choice for going into school. That was the major that made the most sense to me. Nothing else really interested in me. So went to the University of Massachusetts Amherst and took their computer science program. When I was there, it was not exactly the experience I expected it to be. Loved the school, loved the people, but was totally in a very different state of mind when I got there. I kind of grew socially. I had a new set of friends who were taking me to, parties and things, and I was growing as a social individual and not really focusing on my studies. I think one of the biggest reasons for that was I was really interested in kind of software and coding, and that's what I had been doing even on my own, making websites and making little games and stuff. But when I got to school, the computer science major was in the beginning very heavy with theory and what is computable and like mathematics courses, things that to me were like, yeah, they were related to computers, but that's not really where my passion was. When I was a junior, I went abroad to Australia for a semester just to study abroad, and at the University of Australia, or University of Sydney, they had another major there, which was called, they also had computer science, but they also had another major called software engineering. And I talked to a lot of the students there, and what they were doing was like, oh, all you do is like you learn multiple languages, you do lots of pragmatic, you actually build software, you build apps throughout your time there. And if that had been available to me, I think that would have been a much closer to my passion experience than computer science was. But yeah, that's what brought me to UMass Amherst and learning computer science.
Okay, so at this stage, you are studying software engineering. You're getting into it. You're going through the 4-year curriculum. And so, talk to us about the Chinese language component of this, because around this time you're also starting to get into languages as well, right? So why did you decide to study Chinese altogether? And I ask this particularly because now it's a little bit more fashionable, because people are hearing that China is becoming, not even hearing, they are becoming kind of a world superpower. And there's conversation about like business opportunities if you know both languages, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But for you, at the time you were getting into this, it was a little bit earlier than all of that. So talk to us a little bit about kind of how you started learning Chinese and why.
Sure. So it's definitely not a very direct or even intentional path to Chinese. I'll start a little earlier with my experience with French. So I'm obviously a native English speaker. I grew up in the United States, and so when I was in middle school, high school, and college, we had to take a foreign language, and I had no interest in foreign languages at that time, and I took French throughout all of that. I think I had 7 years of French. Now today I don't speak a single word of French. I don't remember, maybe 2 words. I don't really speak any French. Was never really that interested in it. So I was not a person who loves languages. I'm not a langophile or anything, linguist or anything. And when I was in college, computer science and coding was really my only passion. As I said, I was not a super student. I actually had one semester where I did poorly enough in enough classes that I had to extend my 4-year undergraduate career into not just 4 years, but 4 years and another semester. So that put me into an off hiring cycle, and I had accepted a position at Infosys, and I was going to go to India for 6 months of training, which is a essentially an IT consulting company. I think back then it maybe had a slightly different reputation than it does now. But I was going to do that. I had signed up to do that, but because I graduated a semester late, I was kind of free in December, and that program started in June the following year. So I had 6 months to figure out, what else should I be doing, and so I just continued looking for jobs. And I went to a career fair at University of Massachusetts, and a company came, SAC Capital. It was a hedge fund, and I didn't know really much about that. I didn't know much about finance or whatever, but I did have in the back of my mind for a while that I was going to go to business school at some point. So in that time off that I had, I decided to do the GMAT, and I took the GMAT and scored pretty well, and so that was on my resume, which I think not many undergrads had yet. And so that company came and to this career fair, and I saw them, and we did some interviews, and things were going really well. And I was really excited about that company. I didn't know too much about the industry at that point, but it was quite exciting to me because they were really trying to, I think, impress some of the undergraduates. They brought they would take you in a limo to their campus to interview you and stuff like that. And their starting salaries were decent and everything. So I was, as a fresh undergrad, I was very excited about the opportunity. But then it got to the stage where they're like, okay, like things have gone pretty well so far. Can you send us your transcript? And I sent them my transcript, and very quickly afterwards they got back to me and said, okay, we're no longer interested anymore. And so that's really right at the end of college when I had finished all my classes when I realized, okay, like grades and things like that really can matter. So that was not a lesson I had learned before or even during college, but really right at the end of college. So as it turns out, I did end up finding another job before going to Infosys at Galatea, and so I did not end up going to India, did not end up going to Infosys, and I joined another company, which happened to be a financial software consulting company in Boston. And when I was there, they had this policy where if you wanted to take an evening class, they would pay for it. And the only thing they stipulated was the class had to have something related to your work. And so at Galatea, the type of work we were doing was essentially financial software engineering. We were making trading systems and accounting systems and that type of stuff for Wall Street banks. And so any of the classes that we wanted to take had to be economics or finance related, and they would pretty much just sign off on it and pay for it. Now, I think they made that policy thinking, this is kind of a cool perk, but whatever. But for me, I was like, well, look, if you're not taking those classes at night, you're kind of leaving money on the table. So I was taking 1 and then 2 every single semester, even though I was working. These were all evening classes, to the point where I took 11 classes. I mean, I and they were paying for them and the whole time. And I think once I finally left the company, they canceled that policy. I'm not sure if it was because of me per se, but I really took advantage of that. And I finally, for the first time in my life, was really focusing on, the grade. I mean, sure, I wanted to learn, of course, that too, but unlike when I was in college where it was just like, if it's not interesting to me, I'm not going to study it. Now it was like, yeah, I want to get a good grade. And I was thinking in my head, if I apply to grad school at some point, which was the long-term plan, having some good grades on top of, not the best grades in undergrad, that would be helpful. So you asked how I got into Mandarin. Now, one of these classes I signed up for was economics, and I knew that I would be away during the midterm because I had planned a 1-week trip to San Francisco in 2008, I think, 2008. And so 6 weeks before the midterm, I emailed the professor and said, hey, I just signed up for your class. I'm not going to be here during the midterm. I just want to let you know now. We're so far ahead of the time. I'm clearly not trying to avoid my responsibilities or whatever. I will take it early. I will take it late. I'll take it whatever you want, but I won't be able to be here on that day. What should I do? And the response was, don't take the class if you're not going to be here that day. So I was like, oh, geez, that's unfortunate. So I kind of on a whim decided, well, I still, already know I want to be taking classes in the evening. Why not? I was used to it and kind of enjoying it. So I signed up for Mandarin. I really don't know why I did. I certainly didn't have a passion for Mandarin at that point. I had no idea really what it was. I didn't even know that there were characters and no alphabet. I didn't know anything about it. And so I signed up for it. And within the first couple weeks, I really had fell in love with the idea of learning something that was so challenging. So a lot of the other courses I had taken up to that point, financial accounting or whatever, it was pretty not basic, but it was the rules were kind of simple and you learn it and then you know it and you can practice it a bit. But with Mandarin, it just seemed like this almost insurmountable task of, in all the ways that a language can be different from English, it was. And even just looking at it on the page, it was just so, and I hear this a lot. I now, as I know we'll talk later, as my role in HackChinese, I talk to customers a lot who are or students a lot who are learning Chinese, and a common theme is a lot of people who really go far with Chinese love the challenge, and I don't know what it is, but that was certainly it for me. The fact that it was hard. If it was easy, I don't think I would have liked it. I mean, I took 7 or 8 years of French and did not find the same interest in it, but with Chinese, because it was such a complex thing, I really just started to enjoy it more and more. So after one semester, I kind of knew that this was going to be a much bigger passion of mine, completely unexpectedly in my life. And by the middle of the next semester, I had made the decision to um, uh, basically quit my job for a year and move to China and learn Chinese full time for as and get as far as I could. So
Yeah.
certainly
Okay,
not
super
straightforward.
interesting. So when you started learning the language, so like you mentioned, it was the challenge that was appealing to you. Okay, so then you compare that to French. So I'm assuming French was also a challenge because, like you, I also studied French in in high school and junior high and elementary as well. So French
How's
is
your
also
French today?
challenging. Horrible,
Yeah,
literally the
okay.
worst you could possibly imagine. I wouldn't even list it as knowing any of the language,
Yeah,
despite having taken like 6, 7, whatever years of it.
yeah.
So okay, so you mentioned you took French, but you didn't like it. But then you take Chinese and you like the challenge. So what's different between your French experience and your Chinese experience? Like, why didn't you fall in love with learning French at the time?
That's a great question, and I don't think I have a very clear-cut answer, but um, for me, French was an assigned thing that I needed to, it was a task that needed to be completed, and at a time in my life where I didn't necessarily care about grades, and so I was not intrinsically interested in learning it. I didn't see any opportunities to use it. I didn't have any French friends I could practice it with, so it was essentially a very atomic experience where you go into a classroom, struggle to learn this thing that is basically for me at that time in my life valuable only in the confines of that classroom, and I did not put any value on experiences like that at the time. With Chinese, I can't say why for exactly, but I made myself want to do it, or rather, like I nobody told me you need to study this. It was I took a class, found it interesting, and then was self motivated to continue. And I think that's really the main difference. I can't tell anyone why they should learn this thing or learn that thing, but I can say for sure that if you don't want to do it, it's going to be a huge uphill battle. And if you find a reason, whatever that reason is, whether it's there's numerous reasons you might want to learn Chinese or anything else, but if you want to do it, that's the biggest hurdle in my mind. Fighting against something you don't want to learn. I mean, learning's hard. You're constantly trying to push yourself to do things that you don't know how to do and memorize things and practice things, and it's challenging. So if you love it, it'll be way easier. And for me, for French, it was I didn't love it, and so it was much more challenging. Even though French is considered by many to be an easier language to learn for an English speaker.
Right. Okay. So then, what if you compare learning Mandarin to learning software engineering and computer science? Because you mentioned as you were taking computer science, it was really something you enjoyed. So I guess the computer science was when you were in university, there's some level of you're being assigned different things. You still have to do it for a grade. But in the case of learning software engineering, you actually liked it or you seem to have enjoyed it. So what was the process like? Or how did you feel about learning Mandarin versus software engineering? Did you feel like very different between them? Did you get similar feelings? Did you have like the same spark? How did you feel about it looking at those two things and learning Mandarin, especially after you'd finished the software engineering degree?
Yeah, I think there were some similarities. If I felt like I could use the skills that I was learning, it was exciting. And so um, my degree was in computer science, and so there was a lot of that degree that I didn't think was particularly useful. Um, for example, one of the intro classes was theory of computation, and I think now many years later, I might find that interesting, but at the time, it was like, you know, figuring out hard math problems on what is ever going to be computable was not something that could help me build an app. It's not something that could help me solve a problem or really achieve anything that day. So that was not particularly interesting. Whereas the classes that were more software engineering focused of like build this thing, like, build this app, here are the requirements, you'll be able to do this, connect to it, on this, web page or whatever. That was so much more interesting because you were building something, you were creating something, you were doing something that could potentially matter. With Chinese, it was similar in the sense that I felt like the more knowledge I accumulated, the more practiced I became, the more I would be able to actually communicate in Chinese. And that was an interesting prospect to me. I guess you could think of studying computer science is kind of like studying Latin, and studying software engineering would be like studying Chinese. Software engineering allows you to build apps. Learning Chinese lets you speak Chinese, whereas, if you're studying the theory of computation, is kind of like learning Latin, because you can certainly spend a long time doing it, but there's not many people you can actually speak to in Latin. It is not a language used anywhere much around the world today. So yeah, I think that's kind of, maybe that's how I should think about it.
Interesting. So, okay, so now you finished this Mandarin class. Do you take one? Do you only take the one class, or do you take a couple of different Mandarin classes after the first, while you
So
were taking these evening classes?
one evening Mandarin class, and then I signed up for the next evening Mandarin class. So that was the fall and then the spring. But halfway through that second semester, I had already signed up for a year-long program in China that following summer. So pretty quickly, I that passion went from completely unknown to me to this is something I want to focus on.
Okay, so at the time you make this decision that you're going to spend the next year studying Chinese full time in China, so did you decide you're just going to quit your job and just be a full time Chinese student in China? Like, is that what ended up happening?
That's pretty much it. Yep. And so at the time it was the first of many like very early slash midlife crises, kind of, where it was 2009 was a year after the Great Recession. So having a job at all was I was lucky to be in that position, and the fact that I was leaving that to do something totally kind of different. Not everybody thought that was a great idea, but fortunately my parents were very supportive. I mean, I sent them an email one day and said, just so you know, and they had no idea. I was like, just so you know, in 3 months' time, I'll be hopping on a plane. I'll return 12 months later. So, yeah, that is exactly what happened. I don't know.
Was there like a was this just one of those things where you thought of the idea and it felt right, or was there kind of a process of you thinking about this decision, how it's going to impact your life? Did you have any reservations about it? Like, how did you think about this process in between really finding Mandarin to be something you're passionate about and then deciding you're going to like really commit to it with this 1 year program?
Yeah, this was long ago enough now. This is, over 10 years ago. It's hard to believe that I can't remember all the details of what I was thinking back then, but I do remember knowing that I was so excited at the opportunity to do this. And part of that was just because it was something different. It was, so many people kind of just, it's so easy to accept the standard well-beaten paths in life to, most people in the US go through public school system. Most people go to university or college if it's available, and then depending on your major, certain job choices are available, and you go into those, and then you go up the ladder of whatever type of career you are in, and that's all fine and that's good and it's great for most people, and I was going well for me too, but I just was so excited about the chance to do something different. It seemed like an adventure. So I think at that point, before I moved to China, I think probably at most half of my excitement was for Mandarin and Chinese, Mandarin Chinese, and being in China, and the other half was just because it is going to be an adventure. It was going to be something different than what kind of was expected of me at that point. So yeah.
So when you decided to, so before you actually started this 1 year in China, what was your Mandarin level like?
So I had finished 2 evening classes, and when I think I had to memorize 500 words or something like that. But when I got to Beijing, so my year in China, my year in China was 2 semesters, or 2 halves of the year. One half in Beijing, I went to Peking University, and then the other half in Shanghai, I went to Fudan University. When I got to Beijing, they give you like a level placement test, and uh, I basically, it's not really a test that you take with somebody, but I stood with somebody, and we conversed for a little bit, and I did that, and I basically, their program had, I think, like 20 levels, and they put me in level 2. So basically, I was very, very beginner. I was, I thought I would be further along at that point. I thought, like, geez, I've learned so much already. Maybe I'm already more advanced, but that was not the case. I was still very much a beginner, for
Mhm.
sure.
So so why start in Beijing, then go to Shanghai? Why 6 months, 6 months? How did you think about creating like this curriculum for yourself? How did you decide on those two programs to make up this year for you?
So when I was looking at all the different options to get to China, there were a number of companies that offered to basically handle a lot of the logistics for you. So they would enroll you in classes, get you an apartment, find you a tutor, um, you know, that type of thing. And the one that I ended up going with had a number of cities to choose from, a number of programs to choose from, and one of them was this dual, you could do sometime in this city and sometime in this other city. Now, I didn't know too much about China at the time. I didn't know what's better, Shanghai, Beijing, Qingdao, all these places. I had no idea. And so I thought, well, a whole year in my mind, I was like, a year, that's so much time. I'll spend 6 months in the capital, Beijing, and then 6 months in the financial capital, Shanghai, and that'll give me like a really good understanding of China. So that was basically it. I mean, I think at that time, moving to China and doing this whole program was, I think the whole cost, including the fees for this agency and everything else at the time, for the entire year was like maybe 20,000, 25,000 US, something like that, which, um, that's not a small amount of money, but considering that's an entire year of living somewhere, including all that instruction. I mean, my days were 4 hours a day of classroom teaching, 2 hours a day of tutoring, um, and rent and room and board and all that sort of stuff. That's actually was not so bad. That was cheaper than what my living standards was, in the U.S. So to me, it was like, well, if that's the case, I might as well experience as much of the country as I can. So it ended up being, and super happy I made that choice. I think both of those cities, very, very different cultures. I had incredibly different experiences in those two places, and yeah, I think that's a fantastic way to do it. I would recommend other people do the same if they're thinking about it.
Yeah. So the classes per day are like it's like roughly 8 hours of classes a day. Is that
So it
right?
was 4 hours of classroom class per day, and that was with the school. So at Peking University, so my average day, and it was very similar between the two cities. So basically, my average day would be I would wake up and I would go to class. I'd walk to the campus. My apartments were always quite close, very close to the university. I'd wake up, have some sort of breakfast, some coffee, whatever, walk to class and have 2 hours of class, and then there might be a small break, maybe not, and then another 2 hours of class. And those were usually two different teachers and two different subjects. So at one school, they broke down the different kind of modes of language learning, and those are your classes. So some days you'd have like a reading class or a writing class or a listening class or a speaking class, whereas the other at another school we had um, I think reading and or was it, or maybe it was just like Chinese knowledge, comprehensive, something like that, and the other one was specifically speaking, something like that. So 4 hours of class, and then through the program I came with, they would also give you 2 hours of one-on-one tutoring, and so that could be scheduled anytime you want with the tutor. So I usually would finish my class around noon, come home, get some lunch, go to the gym, maybe hang out with my friends, whatever, for a little bit, and then at some point in the afternoon, have a couple hours with one-on-one with a tutor. And that was really I thought the tutor time was a huge made a huge difference, because in a classroom setting, it's challenging to learn as much, to stay super focused, especially because all the students around you. You would think that going to China, enrolling in one of these courses, that everybody would be as focused as you. But most of the other students in these classes were kind of like me when I was an undergrad. They were just like, oh, there because it's like at that point in time, a cheaper place to like spend some time, have an adventure. And I would say 90% of people who were in all those classes didn't really learn much. They didn't really leave the country after that entire 6 months or a year, however long they were there, with much more language skill. Whereas for me, it was like, I'm paying for this. I left my job to do this. I'm really interested in it. And so I cared a lot about making progress. So the classes were interesting. It was a good chance to practice a little bit, but most of my real gains, so to speak, came from self-study and being with a tutor and actually one-on-one sort of chatting with them and going through, whatever curriculum they had for me.
Yeah. So, okay, so here's a question. So, what was life like outside of classes? So now you're living in China, pretty different from being in the US. You're taking classes, but you still have some free time. So, how do you spend your days like this? You know, I guess slight differences between your times in Beijing and Shanghai, but outside of classes, like how did you spend your time? Anything stand out to you about that whole part?
A couple things that I want to touch on. So, one, I spent an enormous amount of time doing self-study. Basically, me in a cafe at night, maybe after dinner, with my Chinese textbooks, preview and reviewing classes and that type of thing. An enormous amount of time, and I think there were some good things to that, and also some not so great things to that. One of the good things to that was, sure, I was quite prepared going into the classes, and I think I made the most out of my time there. I have no regrets on the time I spent studying in general. Um, but there were two things that were, one was unexpected, neutral slash not really negative, but unexpected, and the other one was something that I would not do again. So the thing that was a little bit unexpected was I spent so much time kind of like on my own studying that at the end of that entire year, when I returned to the US, I felt like my social skills had gone down a tiny little bit, because like I just like, as a normal person in your own home country, it was so much interaction with people. You're just wherever you're just used to very fluently interacting with people all the time. And then when I was in China, my language skills, not until near the end was I really able to just spontaneously converse with people kind of at ease. And so I was, spending so much time alone that I feel like I really came back, and it was like a little bit, I had a little bit of maybe social anxiety sometimes, like going to parties and things, and I was like, oh geez, like I gotta talk to people or whatever. And largely that has gone away, but I still feel like wherever I was in college, maybe as like a 20-year-old, like hanging out and partying all the time, maybe I'm still not quite there. I maybe haven't quite made it back to that thing. So that was one thing. Spending so much time doing a certain activity can have an impact on your psychology or something. And then the other thing, which I would not advise students to do, and this is general advice. This is not the case for everybody. I won't say this is something that I don't think anybody learning Chinese should do, but I spent a majority of my time when I was studying on my own, learning to handwrite characters. And nowadays, I don't recommend people spend too much time doing that, because it's not learning Chinese is you do that why? So that you can communicate. And so if you are here, you don't know any Chinese and you want to learn to communicate, there's so many things you need to do to get to here, which is where you can communicate. You can listen quite well, you know enough vocabulary and grammar, and you practice enough with it, you can speak a lot. Going from here to here is like an enormously long task, and being able to handwrite characters is not really on that direct path. So is it fun? Absolutely. I love doing it. That's why I spent so much time doing it. But since then, I haven't used it at all. Whereas all the other skills, reading, speaking, listening, writing, all that sort of stuff, or typing pinyin anyway, is those are the skills that you actually use all the time outside of the classroom. Whereas for me, handwriting was like this fun thing that I did when I was studying, and that was it. Like I never really had a chance to use it outside of that. Nobody ever says, "Oh, hey, can you like write me a note?" And you're like gonna write it, handwrite it or whatever. So yeah, that was one of the things that I think I wouldn't have done again. I probably spent 500 hours in that year handwriting characters, and I've lost most of it because I haven't used it now in 10 years. Whereas all the other skills, reading, writing, listening, all of those continue to go up because I use them. They're expected of you. They're necessary in modern life. Whereas the handwriting, for me anyway, was not something that was particularly useful afterwards.
So for students that are interested in learning Chinese or are studying Chinese now, how much time should they spend on learning to write by hand? Because like one school of thought that I've heard of is just like skip it completely. Everyone uses pinyin. Everyone's using like texting. There may be the odd chance where you're at some place in China and someone asks you to write something, but so that's one end of the spectrum. Others really believe it's like if you want to learn the language, you should learn that as well. So for you, what do you think is the right amount of time to allocate towards learning to write by hand?
It depends what your goal is. If your goal is you want to maximize how well you can communicate in the smallest amount of time, very little of that of your time should be spent towards learning to handwrite because it's not really going to help you be a better communicator. If I had, you know, put it this way, if you had somebody who knew no Chinese at all and you told them in 24 hours somebody is, a Chinese person is going to come here and they don't speak any English, and you are going to want to be able to communicate with him as much as possible. You have 24 hours to spend that time as you will. Will you learn some words, learn how to speak some words, learn how to listen to some things, learn a few phrases, hello, how are you? Or will you spend that time learning to handwrite some of those characters? I don't think I would spend any of that time learning how to handwrite those characters just because it doesn't necessarily help you. Having said that, it is certainly, if you're super interested in Chinese, if you're super interested in the language, the culture, all that sort of stuff, it's super fun, super fascinating. It can help you remember some characters for sure, but it takes an enormous amount of time for a very little amount of communication payoff. I do know some people who are excellent at writing and they keep journals for themselves, and I think that's awesome. And that's incredible. If they're able to do that, I'm sure that's very helpful for their studies. It's probably very useful. I don't think everybody has that amount of time, and most people are interested in speaking. And if you're interested in speaking, I think that most of the time will be better spent listening, speaking, reading, and really treat handwriting characters as kind of like an art form, or an elective on the side. Even people who say you shouldn't spend any time learning characters, a lot of them say you should learn about 100 or so. I can agree with that. I think that you'll what's the Pareto rule? Something like 80-20. If you spend 20 hours learning how to write 50 or 100 characters, you will gain a strong appreciation. You certainly won't know how to write almost anything at that point, but you'll gain a very strong appreciation, big impact for the amount of time that you spent, for kind of how characters are created, and you'll be able to look at them a little bit differently. But after that, I'm not sure it's the best use of the average student's time.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting because this is one of the things I've been trying to think about a little bit as well. So when I took my first two university classes, huge emphasis on writing Chinese.
Mm.
We get these character sheets. You have to like repeat the stroke order for each character one by one, etc., etc., etc. But then I found that if I don't do it for like a month or two, it's like totally out. Like if someone asks me to write it, I won't know how to do it. I can re-remember it, but it's pretty hard. So the what I settled on is I have a new teacher now. She insists on some writing, so I do it. But I would say it's probably like 10 to maybe 10% of my time
Hmm.
spent learning. Um, okay, so that's pretty interesting. So okay,
I
so you're in
think
China now. Oh, go for it.
I think what you said is interesting though. It's you could spend a lot of time doing it, but then outside of the classroom environment, it's not really used. I mean, I can even quiz some of my Chinese friends how do you spell 羡慕, which is like to envy, and they're or not how to spell it, but how to handwrite it, and they're all like, oh, of course I can do it. And then a lot of them start writing it. That's if you're not studying Chinese, if you're listening to this podcast, that's a particularly complicated Chinese character with lots of strokes, and of course they think, of course they can definitely write that, and then they go to write it, and more than half the time they're like, oh, I don't quite remember how to do it, and it's like, yeah, because you don't really do that day to day. You type in pinyin if you want to create characters or whatever, and so um, yeah, why put that extra burden on a student who already has so many disadvantages going into this language? So
Interesting. Okay. So so as you're going through the course of this year, so how does your relationship to the language change? Because you start out probably my understanding is after two evening classes, probably like basic sentences, all that kind of stuff. But then as you're going through this process, you said that towards the end of it, you felt like reasonably comfortable communicating with people. But how was the journey from that? Because something that I've realized, and from all the folks I talk to that are learning Chinese as students, it's not that they can't practice speaking, but it's that the anxiety of doing that, especially with a native speaker, is like quite high. So how does your understanding of the language change like throughout this 12-month period, starting from two basic Chinese classes in the evening, at the end of it, you can now communicate like pretty comfortably if I'm not putting words in your mouth. So yeah, talk a little bit about that.
before I went to China, I said I'm going to spend a year focusing on this language. Wow, I've never done that in my life with any topic. At the end of this year, I'm going to be completely fluent. How cool is this? That was certainly very naive of me. Um, I think when I first got there, I thought being in the country is going to make a big difference. And now I realize that that wasn't quite the case. I think because I was in the country focusing full time on the language, that made a difference. But um, before you reach a pretty decent level, um, me being on the streets of China didn't really like help me learn faster because I was picking up nothing. I mean, I was, certainly when I first landed there after my two introductory courses in the U.S., being on the street and I could go into a cafe and people would ask the simplest of questions and I would get nothing. Cab drivers, I understood nothing. Maybe ni hao if I could hear if they spoke it slowly enough. So yeah, I I spent a lot of time in classes, a lot of time with my tutors, and my skills definitely were improving. But I remember halfway through my time, at the end of the first semester, when I was finished with my time in Beijing, I thought, wow, I'm halfway done with my course here, and I am so much less fluent than I thought I would be. I thought like, oh geez, after even 6 months of focusing on something full time, you'll be, you'll have such an incredible amount of skill, and then another 6 months on top of that, you'll just be polishing the rough edges, right? And that was just my own naivety. Certainly not everything about my program was perfect. There could have been ways to move faster, certainly, but nonetheless, I think language takes a long time, takes a large amount of practice. One thing that I kind of want to talk about is a lot of people think Chinese is hard because of characters and tones, and I think that is true, but those things are totally surmountable challenges. I mean, the pronunciation is actually not very complicated. There's not too many syllables that you have to learn. Um, And tones, yeah, you need to spend some time on them, but if you're focusing on it and you have a teacher and you practice, most people get through that. Maybe they don't speak as perfectly, as perfect as a native person, native Chinese person, but they get through that. And the characters, yeah, you have to learn them, and maybe someday somebody will invent some tool to help you learn characters faster. I don't know. um, learning characters is also something that you can overcome. It's one way or the other, you get through that. Those to me aren't the really hard. Those aren't the reasons that Chinese is very hard. Some of the reasons Chinese is very hard that I think is kind of the nature of the world today, which is everybody's studying English. That's a huge that is makes it a huge challenge to learn Chinese because I was in China for a year as a full-time language student, focusing on Chinese, no other goal. All I wanted to do was practice, and almost everybody who I spoke to who was under the age of 30 would try to speak with me in English. And to make matters worse, their English had been something that they had studied academically at least for at least a decade since they were in primary school or whatever. So the path of least resistance was always their intermediate English. And so if you want to reach fluency in a language, you have to practice at the beginner level, practice at the intermediate level, and then practice here. But if in that beginner stage you're really really fumbling, and then other people in the country, Chinese people see you and they think, oh well, you're trying to communicate. That's what you're trying to do, and my English is good enough at this level, or even better than your Chinese right now. Let's speak in English. It becomes very challenging. I have many friends who were born in China, moved to the U.S. for grad school or whatever, and within 2 or 3 years, their English level is just so excellent. And I can't say this, scientifically for sure if this is the reason, English is easier. I don't think so. I think English is quite challenging. There's so many exceptions. There's lots of idioms too. But the fact is, they basically speak English all day, every day when they're out in public, when they're interacting with anybody. You can't go to a restaurant, you can't go to a KFC and expect to speak to Chinese. You can't expect the person there to yeah, their native language is English, but they also speak some Chinese on the side. That's just not the case. But that really is the case in China, at least in the major cities of Shanghai, Beijing, those type of places. So. Right. So the question was, I don't know, how did I feel kind of going from beginner to near the end? Yeah,
Actually,
go ahead.
actually, so one follow up question on that. So okay, so when you hit that point, because I had the same experience when I was in China, and I and not even in China. So if I'm using a language learning app or something like that, like Tandem or italki, which are great apps for finding conversational kind of language practicing partners for the audience. Even then, there's a tendency to default to English when something is unclear. So as you're in this stage of beginner trying to get to intermediate, somewhere around there. So how do you deal with that? Would you just yeah? How did you deal with that?
It's quite simple to understand how to do it, and maybe not as easy to implement. But it's simply the path of least resistance. When humans are trying to communicate, they fall back to this path of least resistance. So sometimes people say, oh, just find a Chinese speaking girlfriend, right, or boyfriend.
I've heard that all the time. Yeah.
Yeah. That totally works unless that person's English is better than your Chinese, in which case you're trying to communicate and it's going to fall back to that. It's not their fault, it's not your fault, but that's just what's going to happen. So if you're looking for tutors, find a tutor who doesn't speak English. Problem solved. 100%. If you're moving to a place in China, I strongly advise not going to Beijing or Shanghai. If you have to go to one of those places, don't live in the expat areas. Don't hang out with other foreign students. Just avoid that problem entirely, and then it's not a problem. You'll still need to communicate, and it will have to be in Chinese. You know, that beginner from beginner to intermediate is not about. It's not about being perfect at all. It's just about opening your mouth. It's just about getting your point across. To get from here to here, you have to make so many mistakes. you have to. You can't be like, oh, I'm just going to sit with my books and learn how to speak perfectly, and then I'm going to speak this beginner Chinese at this perfect bit, and then I'm going to learn intermediate Chinese until I know it perfectly, and then start speaking it perfectly. It's never going to work that way. You have to get some baseline knowledge and practice the heck out of it, and just open your mouth, keep speaking, keep speaking, keep speaking. It'll be lots of times you say the complete wrong thing. Doesn't matter. There's no other way. You just have to practice, practice, practice. So avoid the problem. Just find locations where their English is not an option, because if it is an option, it's going to be harder. Now, having said that, the problem flips too. Once you pass a certain level and your Chinese is quite good. So here's an example. If I go to, say, Starbucks in a random Chinese city, most people, if they're hired at Starbucks anyway, many places, but certainly at Starbucks, they probably have to have a certain baseline level of English. And they also probably know a quite well a certain canon of phrases and vocabulary, like, coffee, milk, grande, hot, cold, whatever, that type of stuff. So they're pretty fluent at a small canon of stuff. And so you come in, they don't know who you are. You're speaking to them. You order something. You might try to order in Chinese. I'll have a latte or whatever, and they'll respond to you in English. Okay, no big deal, fine. But then let's say something about the order is wrong. All of a sudden you're outside of their canon. If you just stay in Chinese and make it obvious to them, you're not showing off. It just becomes obvious that now the path of least resistance is clearly Chinese, because I'm using phrases and words that you don't know how to use in English, and so they will no longer try to use that English. It'll just flip over. And maybe the Starbucks example isn't a good one, but it does flip. If you're in maybe a cab, riding in a cab is a better example, because the conversations can kind of go anywhere, right? You get in, and usually the cab drivers will say in English, "Where are you from?" Like that type of thing, and like, "What are you doing?" And it's great. They're practicing a little bit of the language they know, and trying to be friendly with you. But then you can start talking about why you moved here, what you're doing, what cities you went to, and all that sort of stuff, and you can speak with more Chinese, and of course it will change to Chinese at that point, because the path of least resistance is no longer English. So.
Huh. Okay. Okay. So sorry I interrupted you earlier. So now, as you're going through this, so how does your relationship to the language change as you're going through this process? So you mentioned you hit the halfway mark. It's not as your progress isn't as much as you wanted, but how does it continue from there on? Like,
my passion for it increases and increases and increases. I think there's a certain point pretty early on, maybe not in your first, I don't know, 100 hours or 100 characters. I don't know. There's in the very, very beginning, it's also challenging that it might be exciting because it's novelty. But very quickly that goes away, and you start entering this phase where literally everything you learn is usable, because you're still kind of a beginner, right? Like you're in the grand scheme of the language, you're still learning things that are used very frequently. I remember there was that second semester, so at the end of that time, I passed the HSK 4, which is certainly still kind of beginner in the grand scheme of things, but it's further than I think most foreigners get. Maybe that's true. And so that second semester, everything you were learning was like immediately applicable. You would hear it in TV shows. If you learned vocabulary, it was relevant. You could use it very soon after. You would find it in TV shows. You'd hear it in conversations. So at that stage, it was the most exciting stage, I think, for me, of learning Chinese. Maybe that, and really that continued all the way to into HSK 5 almost. So that was great, because you could sitting and studying is maybe not so fun, but if you know that, like, oh, here's a word, like I literally could have used this yesterday in a conversation, or like you learn a word and then like the next day you hear it on the subway and you're like, oh, it's the first time I've heard that word in the wild or whatever. That's a really, really exciting place to be. Whereas before that, it's quite challenging, but maybe you have the novelty keeping you going. And then afterwards, once you get into a little bit more advanced, you're learning things still very important for you to know if you want to get further in the language, but nowadays, I could learn something and I may never see it in the wild, because currently I don't live in a Mandarin speaking environment all the time, but learning Chengyus, or learning idioms, or learning grammar patterns or vocabulary that is like way less used is more challenging because it's back to the like, oh, now it feels a little bit more like a slog because like, yeah, I have to learn it and it's like important and this is knowledge I definitely want. But if you're not able to immediately use it, it's not as fun. It kind of goes back to the university thing of like computer science versus software engineering. It's not immediately applicable, so it's a little bit less exciting. Yeah.
Okay. So by the time you finish this 12-month period, oh, by the way, for people that aren't studying Mandarin too, so the there's a system called HSK, which basically measures your proficiency level. There's levels 1 to 6. It gets way harder to go up each level as you kind of progress down that path. So Daniel mentioned he was level 4, which is like intermediate-ish, lower intermediate kind of thing.
Yeah, funny enough, they measure it. One of the ways they look at those exams is by how many words you know, and so every exam doubles the amount of the previous one. So the highest exam, HSK 5, is HSK 6 is 5,000 words. HSK 5 is 2,500 words. HSK 4 is 1,200 words. So it's kind of intermediate or even beyond that on the nominal scale of 1 to 6, but you're actually less than a quarter of the way there to the HSK 6 mark. And even the HSK 6 mark nowadays is, I mean, they're about to double that all the way to, so it's still quite a beginner. Even though even though I had spent so much time and so much effort and learned a lot and practiced a lot, I was still reasonably on the beginner side of things.
Right. So by the time you finish, did you finish at HSK 4 or did you go beyond that? Like by the time you ended it, this exchange, where were you at? And yeah, can you speak to that a bit?
Yeah, so at the end of the year, I did take the HSK 4. I think I did pretty well on that exam, but at that point, it was the exam was less. I mean, before I went to China, I didn't even know about the exam. I didn't care about the exam. That was the first time I took an HSK. Some people take HSK 1, 2, 3, 4. I didn't even know about it or care about it before I went. But then at the end of my program, I was like, oh, I've been studying for a long time. Let's see where I am. I figured out roughly based on what I was studying, what should I take. Took the HSK 4. Afterwards, after I left China, I continued my studies and took more exams. But at that point, I had taken HSK 4. It was probably maybe a little bit beyond that, but roughly at that level. And that was a really cool level to be at because certainly to a native speaker, I probably sound a little bit elementary, but nonetheless, you could get around. When I had friends visit and they saw me interacting with Chinese people, I remember one person said, "Oh yeah, this is my friend Dan. He's fluent in Mandarin." Now, in my head, I was like, "I'm so far from fluent," but like to them, it made sense because I could communicate, we could get our point across. If we were checking into a hotel, we needed things, I could ask for them, I could understand the responses, all that sort of stuff was happening. So that was a great place to be in. Yeah.
Very cool. Okay, so you're coming to the end of this. You've like left your job. You're coming to the end of like this adventure in China. Obviously, you studied the language quite a bit. So like, at what point do you start thinking, okay, like what am I going to do next? Like what? So what's after the 12-month period? When did you start thinking about that? How did you think about that? What ideas came to mind?
When I first landed in China in 2009, I was applying to grad schools already for the following year. So by halfway through the program, I was accepted into some schools, and so I knew that when I finished my year in China, I would go back to the U.S. and I would start at grad school. Yeah, that had been kind of the plan from the beginning, and fortunately that worked out. So I was able to know where I was heading afterwards. And my experience being in China probably helped with applications and things. And I did all my interviews in China. They had recruiters, and it was kind of interesting because the recruiters would be in China. Usually they would come to like some hotel and have like people come in all day and interview, and like they'd be like, well, I interviewed 40 people today. They were all like mainland Chinese, and here's this one white guy from Boston, and so that probably helped me stand out a little bit, for sure.
So the masters you signed up for were a master's in finance and an MBA, right?
Yeah.
So why those two subjects? And then given that you'd spent a year in China, were you like, how did you feel about it? Were you like, okay, I want to go back to the States. This was a great adventure. Did you want to come back and work there? How did you think about now combining? Because like when I think about this, you basically took some time to do like evening classes and your job. Then you took a whole break to go do just Chinese. Now you have to think about reconciling the two again. So how did you think about pursuing your studies versus Chinese? How are you going to maintain that? What the relationship between the two of them would be?
So before I quit my job to go to China, I was at Galatea, and we were financial software engineers essentially. Uh, at that time, this is probably less so now, is my guess, but at that time, for the banks that we were working for, software people were still kind of seen as second-class citizens versus the finance people. It was just like places like Morgan Stanley and other that were our clients had a long history of finance people being the ones who drove all the business, and that were the ones who were like, that's what their firm is all about. Kind of like if you went to Google, would you want to be an engineer at Google or an accountant? Both excellent jobs, but at Google, the engineers are the ones that are seen as like, oh, well, that's what Google's all about. Well, so when I was at Galatea, working for these financial companies, it was the financial people who were kind of seen as like, oh, that's like the main event. So that really impacted my thinking a lot, and so that's why I decided to go to grad school and do MBA and MS in finance. I was like, oh, like I want to be part of like that side of the team. I kind of know some of the coding stuff, and that's great, but I really want to join the other side of the team because that was always the more glamorous isn't quite the word, but it's just really, that's that was kind of the main event at those firms that I was familiar with. So that's why I had signed up for those two things. And in my mind, I was like, oh, I'm going to go spend a whole year in China. I'm going to come back completely native level fluent, of course, right? um, and so when I was putting this plan into motion, it was like, I'm going to go to China, do the year, apply to grad school. I'll finish the year, be completely fluent, haha, and then go to grad school and get and do a career transition from the tech side of things uh, to the finance side of things. And I just assumed that I would never need to study Chinese again after having put so much time and effort into it. Um, but of course, when I got back, I tell people coming back, leaving China at that time, it was actually very hard because I had spent so much time learning Mandarin, and just before I left, I mean, like the last month was when I really like started to feel very comfortable living there in terms of using the language all the time. I mean, it really was like quite an uphill battle until I got to that point of like, wow, now I really feel like certainly I could have conversations before then, no problem. But at that point, I really felt like, wow, now like just existing here is actually helping. Like every time I interact with anybody at any situation, it's helping my language. I'm feeling good about it. I'm using it a lot. I'm speaking it a lot. Everything feels very good. And then I was like taken away from that area and put in in a city in the US where it was like now I have almost no chance to use it unless I force it upon somebody or whatever. And I often say it's kind of like being a pianist who lives on an island with no pianos. I have these skills, I have these things I want to use, but I have no chance to use them. So I could not wait to get back to China. I could not wait to get back to an environment where I could speak Chinese all the time. So in the subsequent years, I kind of never stopped, taking online tutors, in-person tutors. Fortunately, Boston is a place where there's a large population of Chinese people as students or otherwise. So I continued studying in my own way for a while, but I could not really wait to get back to China and have a chance to continue practicing those skills.
Yeah.
And I did when I was in grad school. I did one semester abroad back in Beijing. I almost forgot about that. One semester abroad back in Beijing. The school I had, so I went to Boston College, and they had a sisters or a partner school, something. And that school had a collaboration with Peking University, which was the school I had gone to the prior year. And so I was able to basically get people to agree for me to take classes there for one semester. And so I went there and did some MBA classes there in English at an English program. And of course, studied more Chinese when I was there. But at the end of all that, I still, it was kind of like never enough. Maybe you have this obsession with either this language or any other skill. Like once you kind of know that it's something that you like doing and you want and you are enjoying it, like you can never really get enough. And the fact that it was like challenging and I had to go there, like I could not wait to get back to that environment.
Right.
And yeah.
So, so I guess it's one thing to love the intellectual kind of like stimulation of learning this language. There's a challenge to it. There's another part, which is if you're living there, you're living with a pretty different culture, different values, different rules, different food, different everything. So, how did you feel about the cultural element of it? Like, language aside, living there as a foreigner in China, how did you feel about that? Especially as you're coming back to the US. So, I guess there's two parts to this. One is kind of how you think about it as someone who's mainly been in the US, and then you go to China for the first time, you spend this time. After spending the time there, now you come back, and then you get like the reverse of being in China for a while and then going back to the US. So how did you like what was your cultural experience like, and like what were your feelings like towards the culture as you were towards both cultures, really, American and Chinese?
Yeah, in the beginning, a large part of my appreciation and enjoyment of my whole experience was the fact that it was an adventure. So many things were different, but I enjoyed that. I have heard some people say they go somewhere, things are very different, not necessarily bad, but different, and that is too much for them. They're not used to it and they don't like it. I was fortunate enough that I really enjoyed the adventure aspect of it, and I think that carried me through a lot. Um, Having said that, I wouldn't say that I'm not as much a Chinese culture lover, and I'm not the kind of person who loves everything about Chinese culture, and that's why I'm studying the language. That's not really the case. I think it's there's a ton of really interesting things that I appreciate about it. There's also a ton of interesting things that I appreciate about other cultures, especially including the culture I came from, the United States or whatever. For me, the large draw and the understanding what was truly the language, and everything else was just sort of, oh, that's associated with it. That's what comes with it. Um, Having said that, as you spend more time in a culture, you learn to appreciate some things more. Certain things, certain etiquettes, or certain pieces of how gifts are given or how appreciation is shown. Excuse me. Um, that type of stuff, I think, becomes something that it grows on you, and you learn to and you start to have positive feelings towards more of those things. So that's there, but I don't think it was originally like a huge draw for me. I've heard of people who study Japanese, and it's because they want to watch anime,
Anime. Yeah.
yeah, things like that. I didn't have that. I like kung fu movies, but just as much as all the other action movies with a bunch of guns in the U.S. or whatever. So it wasn't really like this huge draw towards Chinese culture as much as it was kind of the language for me.
So at this point, when you think about it, so now as you're going through grad school, you've done this exchange. Does it occur to you at some point there that you definitely want to live in Asia for the foreseeable future? Do you think of it as just like, oh, the next chapter is going to be working a little bit in Asia? Or did you think even beyond that? So, as you're thinking about where you're going to be located physically, how do you like how does that guide your thinking as you're entering the final stretches of grad school and you're thinking about jobs in the next phase of your life and all that?
I definitely wanted to get back to Asia. That was a very strong driver in my mind. There's a lot of other things that made that thinking and decision easy. If I was studying some kind of very esoteric language on some island with no economic future, that would have been a harder thing to put all those pieces together. But and feel like that was a good idea. But I was obsessed with the language, and it was a blossoming economy, a big important country in the world. So I very much wanted to get back, and I made that known to basically everybody when I started my full-time job at State Street. I don't know if this is a good idea for most people for career progression, but I made it known to everybody right away that, like, oh yeah, I'm trying to get to China. If there's any opportunities, let me know. And I would network as much as possible. Oh, somebody who's working in the China office. I want to go talk to them, meet them. I spent I spent a couple week vacation in China. This is just me on my own dime flying over to Asia. But when I was there, I also set up as many, I think, like 10 meetings with various people from State Street in a couple of their offices in China just to meet with them, talk to them, see what they're doing. And yeah, all of that was to try to get a job over there for sure, right? I mean, sure, yeah, I was interested in what you're doing. I care about your business unit. Yeah, I was very good, good, good. But like at the end of the day, it was like, I hope you remember my name when I come back. So if something does pop up that might be reasonably associated with the chance, that I could come over there, that might happen. Um, yeah, and yeah.
So was the motivation for you? So you mentioned on the culture, you're kind of like, there's certain parts of it that are interesting to you, some parts that are not so interesting. The language is really interesting to you, and you're interested in business opportunities, but like it seemed like you were really like you really, really, really wanted to go do this. So do you think it was just the idea of continuing to further down the path of this language, or like what was it that pulled you so strongly to go back?
It was a large part was the language, for sure, just furthering my own studies of it, and then um, I think especially having had that situation in undergrad where um, I was basically got really excited about a job and it was turned down because of grades, and then afterwards uh, I became quite a motivated person and or quite a ambitious person in terms of career or whatever, and I wanted to maximize my chance of having not necessarily a lot of money or whatever, but just I wanted to have a successful career, and I felt like a way to stand out and be a way to maximize that chance would be to highlight some of the experiences I had, or really at least leverage some of the opportunities that I had. And I had spent some time in China, and I was from the U.S., and so I thought, maybe that would be a good way to, maybe you could someday be somebody who bridges these two cultures in some way, and that could be a valuable place to be from a career standpoint. So certainly language, biggest one, number one for sure, but it was also just, this was not an unimportant language and culture and country to be associated with, and especially coming from another important part of the world. So being sort of a bridge in the middle might be a good place to be.
So now we're getting into the part, the banking part of your story. So as you're at this bank, kind of like how was it working at State Street, the working culture? You kind of mentioned like your big passion underneath a lot of this was that you wanted to move back to Asia. So how long did you spend at State Street?
I joined in 2012 and left in 2017, so about 5 years. Yeah.
Okay. So what was your journey like there? Because I know that you started in Boston, you eventually transferred to Hong Kong. So do you want to talk about like one that transition, but just kind of how you were feeling throughout all of this? Because um, I have quite a few friends in banking. Banking has a particular reputation associated with it at times. So as someone that had basically gone from being kind of like totally autonomous, independent, doing their own thing in China, you know, on this adventure. Then you go back to grad school, you're learning again. Now you're working at a very large bank. What was that experience like?
That was yeah, it was a great experience. Largely, I was very lucky to always be under the kind of, I guess I'll call it, mentorship of really great managers or bosses I had. Um, Really, just a string, one after the other, of bosses that respected me, gave me challenging work, gave me lots of responsibility, um, really asked me to step up to the plate a couple times and do things that pushed me beyond my limits. So I was incredibly lucky in that sense. The work culture there was a bit of a blend. I think the average people often think of banking culture as super cutthroat, working really, crazy long hours, and you eat what you kill, kind of salesmanship mentality, that type of thing. And that was certainly true for some of our clients. So State Street is a custody bank, and so what essentially what a large part of what we did and what the unit that I worked in did was I worked in the alternative investments division. So basically, our clients would be hedge funds, our clients would be private equity funds, and what we would do for them is so what they wanted to do, if you take a hedge fund, what they want to do is they want to make buy and sell decisions, whether it's with algorithms or people, whatever. That's what they want to do, and they want to take a lot of risk, earn a lot of return on that, and they don't really want to do any of the other stuff. Well, we would do all the other stuff for a fee. So we would do their brokerage bookkeeping, we would do their accounting, we would do their investor calls, we would do basically everything for them that wasn't the one thing that they cared about. And so what that meant was the culture at those places was probably more cutthroat, and they had a lot of money on the line. They could have some quarters where they made a incredible amount of money and things were feeling really good and things were really great, or they could have quarters or years where they lost money and tensions are high and people are angry or whatever, whereas we would kind of just be a more flat, like, well, we're charging you a fee and we're doing all this stuff for you. It's like a service environment, right? So the culture, we still had a lot of the banking culture in terms of like really way too long hours, especially when I got to Hong Kong, long hours, and but it was I don't know, I guess I'd call it like banking light or something like that, because it was certainly in the financial industry for sure. I mean, State Street is I think I haven't been there for many years now, but I think State Street custody is like a third of the world's assets, right? I mean, it's a huge name, but most people haven't heard of it because it's not a retail bank. It's not you can't, as an individual person, you can't go down the street and open up an account at State Street. Maybe you can now if they have a retail division. I don't even know. But the bread and butter was servicing these these other clients. So I really liked it. I thought that there were parts of that culture that I loved. I actually liked wearing a suit every day. I thought that was fun. It made me feel kind of good. I liked the politics of it. I liked talking to people and learning how to kind of climb the ladder a bit. I know some people absolutely hate that, and probably a large part of that has to do with who are your managers, what's your experience like, who are your coworkers. I was very fortunate. Had I could name almost everybody I worked with or for at State Street was just pleasant, but also just there's so many good. I have a lot of good feelings about that. And I remember when I actually left State Street, there's an interesting story there too, which is jumping ahead a bit, but I'll say it because it's on my mind. So it was a surprise when I told my manager in Hong Kong that I was leaving, because she had essentially, after a year of my working to make this happen, they had offered me a position to move to China. And that is when that happened. Basically, that all came together, and we had signed all the papers, and I was gonna go, similar to the Infosys thing. But then I decided to do something else, HackChinese. But it was a bit of a surprise, and so when she actually gave me the year end, there was a year end bonus or whatever, and so once that happened, she said, "Oh, this is your comp or whatever," and it's a conversation you have every year. And I turned around and I said, "Great, I also have some news. I'm actually leaving," and she was very surprised because I had tried so hard to get this other opportunity in the firm, and they had finally worked to make that happen. And she was like, why are you leaving? And I said, this is the truth. I'm not being pushed away by State Street at all. There's nothing about this place that I don't like or I find annoying. I'm just being pulled towards this other thing, that there's this passion that I really need to chase at the moment. And so that was really it. I loved State Street, and that type of work culture was quite good.
Okay, so at that stage, you mentioned you're lobbying basically to get into a position in the mainland, but at some point here, you start thinking about leaving State Street to start your language learning startup, HackChinese. So where does that all start? How did that all start to come up?
So when I first got to Hong Kong, I knew that I wanted to more formally practice Chinese more and take more lessons or whatever. And I thought, okay, I am in a very different situation than I was when I moved to Beijing and Shanghai a couple years prior, because for one, I was definitely not a beginner anymore. Two, I was I was an adult learner at that point too, but I was no longer a beginner. I couldn't do it full time. I had a full time job, but I wanted to continue my studies, and I think a lot of I don't know if a lot of people think this, but I certainly felt like, okay, well, one of the obvious moves is to sign up at a school, right? To get a teacher involved, and I don't think that's necessarily a wrong move. Um, anyway, so I have more to say on that probably, but so when I got here, in the first 2 weeks, I found all the language schools in Hong Kong. I thought, gee, you're so close to China, and plus it's Hong Kong. There must be a lot of schools. Well, there were. There's like 20 language schools here. And in the first 2 or 3 weeks, I went to 11 different schools to do a 1 hour trial. And I was like, I don't want to just like do this, haphazardly. I want to see, is there a real difference? Like, I don't want to end up in a school or a set of teachers that just happens to be not as good as I could have just because I was lazy to try. So I invested like a good amount of time, every day at lunch for 2 weeks going to a different school, doing their 1 hour trial. Next one, when collecting this information of like what's going to be the best place to learn. And I found that there was not a huge difference in the kind of learning quality between all these different schools that charge a bunch of different prices. But I ended up going with one. I found a tutor and had that. It wasn't until a year after that. I always recommend people, if they have a one-on-one tutor, you don't have to leave them after a certain amount of time, but after a year or so, I tell my tutors now in the beginning when I start with them, like, in about a year's time, I'm going to leave you because you'll be used to my mistakes and you'll stop correcting them. And so don't feel bad when that happens. And I did. So a year later, I moved to another teacher, and then another year I moved to another teacher. And at one point I got my company to pay for a big piece of the most expensive language classes I have ever had. It was at a company that did very specific finance-related Mandarin, and thought, okay, this is going to be, I mean, the prices were 4 times more. I mean, it was in the hundreds of dollars an hour for speaking practice, and I was like, okay, this is going to be totally different. This is going to be like a step above what you get for, for paying, online tutors or whatever. And for sure, it was like, definitely they were more prepared, and the class quality was very, very high and all that. But this was kind of one of the larger sparks of the idea of where HackChinese came from, which was all of these institutions I'd ever been to are really good at providing you lots of content that you need to learn, and then maybe even giving you some practice with learning them. But like, what's the, nobody achieves a high level of language competence without an incredible amount of self-study, like things that you can do on your own. And at none of these places was there a really good, solid plan for how I was going to retain the things that I had learned. So, if I was paying $10 an hour to somebody on italki and learning a bunch of things, great. If I was paying a couple $100s an hour and learning some other more specialized things that maybe only they know, great. But then there needs to be some sort of way afterwards for you to retain that, for you to really, make sure that you're not, because if you just practice like once a week for an hour, you're going to forget most of it by the time you come back. You need to figure out how you're going to study. And most of the advice from all these places is you just review, and that's interesting. But when you're at that level of language with thousands and thousands and thousands of vocabulary words and lots of different stuff to read and memorize and all that, like, that's actually a pretty difficult problem. And there's a lot of tools out there that did what HackChinese ends up doing, but they were cumbersome to the point where I felt like if I sat down to study, it would take me I would use up a good chunk of my study time just managing like software or figuring out what do I study today or whatever. So I kind of always had in my mind that I wanted to do this HackChinese thing. And actually, I'll go back to 2012 when I had gotten back from China. I had taken all my learnings from my year there and like focusing on the language and put it into an ebook, like, I don't know, 100-page ebook, and sold it online on hackchinese.com. I just really liked the name, the kind of what that meant. It was like, yeah, like, make some faster progress or whatever with it. So there was always this like idea in my mind, this little bit of like branding idea, and like but it was really that it was at one of these schools, here in Hong Kong, I had spent a lot more than I had other places, and even there, the experience was very similar in terms of like the review capabilities that they were expected of you. Even though like that particular place, the learning quality in class was very, very high, teachers were very, very prepared, the content was on point, all that sort of stuff, but it was still like, but there's this like elephant in the room of like, but I'm gonna forget most of this by the time I come back, and like nobody's really giving me any way to make sure I don't. So um, I was thinking about Hack Chinese for a while, but it was really that last 1 year before I quit that I probably every other night was agonizing over it. I was talking to my parents, my family, and my friends, and all these, all my support. Like, should I do this? Should I like leave and try to solve this problem, even though I have this like career and kind of going this way? And yeah, so it was. I don't know. I have no idea what your question was. Something about like how was my thought process? I don't know, but I thought about it a very long time.
So, okay, so you pass up on the opportunity to go to China, which was your goal for a very long time, and you decide to build. So eventually you decide to quit State Street and go full time to build Hack Chinese. So in that in that moment, how did you plan it out? Because one of the interesting things about you is that you are the sole developer, designer, and I think until recently even marketer for Hack Chinese. So you're thinking about leaving, and how did you plan that phase, leaving State Street and then going to pursue Hack Chinese full time?
So my belief in the necessity for the product, I think, maybe played an outsized role in my confidence of doing it. I certainly didn't have every understanding of how the journey would go, not at all. Even if I did, it went totally in different ways in the following years. I looked back at my decision to go to China a couple years prior, and that was like completely off the beaten path. It was something that most people don't do, and it turned out to be the best decision of my life. Um, and it felt to me like another one of those opportunities. Like most people would probably say, oh, you have like a career that you've gotten several credentials for, you've climbed the ladder a bit, you're on like a good path to a decent spot, you're heading towards some things that you've wanted, and a lot of things are kind of going well, and but on the other hand, I was like, sure, but I certainly think that there's a need for this product, but I also felt like, what an experience would that be to try to like build a company in a foreign country. And it's, worst case scenario, I did not leave on bad terms at any of the places I had worked before. I was still I didn't burn any bridges, at least that I know of. I had a decent skill set and set of credentials that I feel like I could get back into that industry if I needed to. But on the other hand, even if Hack Chinese was a complete commercial failure, I knew that I would learn a lot. I would learn a lot about coding, building a business, marketing, language, and so in the end, when I was, it was a lot of anguish in my head trying to figure out, do I want to do this? Because this was clearly quite a big decision in my life, probably the biggest decision of my life, even more so than going to China, because at that point I had a lot less to lose or whatever. But I think the turning point for me was when I realized that it took me about a year to figure out if I wanted to do this. And during that time, I spent most of the time trying to say, how can I do both of these things? Can I take the new job in China, in State Street, even though it's a new role, I have a huge new learning curve, and also work on this on the side? And I ended up spending a lot of time on nights and weekends trying to build Hack Chinese, not even build Hack Chinese, but trying to learn web development and the different technologies that I ended up using. And it was just not enough time to do it. And so the turning point was really when I realized I need to sacrifice something. I need to sacrifice one or the other of these dreams. And that actually was an enormous relief, an enormous weight off my shoulders, because I realized I allowed myself to have a sacrifice. Because before it was such a struggle, because I was like, oh, I can't give up A just because I want B. I have to figure out how I can do both. And it was such a struggle because there was no real way. If I moved, had I moved to China and done that particular part of the dream or whatever, and taken that new role, which I would have needed for a visa and everything else to be there, I just would not have had the time to work on this other thing. So once I realized, okay, yes, if you want to do this, it's a sacrifice. Just acknowledging that, I can't remember when that came to me, but it was definitely like a eureka moment. Like, oh yeah, like if I want to do this other thing, you have to give something up. Okay, so now that I know that that's true, which one do I want more? And it was very clear I wanted this one more. I wanted to chase this dream. I wanted to build this product, to try to build a company, to see how far that could go. That was more important to me. And so, yes, it was a sacrifice for sure. But that's all it was. It was a sacrifice of something, and you know there was no other way in my mind to figure out how to do it. So now I often say when people ask when they're trying to decide between big things in life, go-to piece of advice I use now based on that experience was if you're spending a lot of time figuring out how you don't need to make that choice, that's probably not a great use of your time if you know that you can't actually not make that choice. If you want to do A or B and they're mutually exclusive, recognize they're mutually exclusive, realize that you need to make a sacrifice, and then it's just side to side which is the merits are better, and then it's easier because that alone is a hard decision. If you're trying to also figure out is there this third choice where you can have both things when you know there's really not, it's not a good use of the mental energy. So that's how I decided to finally
Hmm.
jump towards it.
But at this point, you're basically so you haven't. So you mentioned that you started kind of working on Hack Chinese in the evenings and nights, but aside from that, you hadn't had a technical job or like a software engineering job for like 5 plus years, right? So did you was it were you always coding during the period that you were a banker or on various things, or did you literally say, okay, I have to pick up everything again now and kind of ramp back up in order to pursue this dream?
More of the latter. I had dabbled in Visual Basic behind my Excel sheets to go fast at my banking job, but essentially, yeah, what I had learned in at the University of Massachusetts was Java, Lisp, that type a bunch of other languages, and then in my job at Galatea, I was actually using Natural Adabas, which is this it's a programming language as old as Python. I mean, it was like mainframe stuff. And then we got to okay, I'm modern web languages, which is what I was going to use to build Hack Chinese. I essentially it was like learning from scratch. Yeah, the principles of coding helped enormously for sure, undoubtedly, but all the languages I had to learn from scratch. I had never really. I think I had taken some database courses in college, but that was so long ago I didn't really remember it. I had to do all that again. So I used a company called launchschool.com, and I have great things to say about them. They have a curriculum that basically goes towards mastering the fundamentals. So it's a very long curriculum. I mean, when I quit State Street in 2017, I spent 8 months full time, 40 to 50 hours a week just doing this. I mean, to call it a boot camp is probably a misnomer. It's probably not the right way to label it because I think a lot of boot camps are 12 weeks, 40 hours a week, and you build a couple apps and you kind of understand it. Whereas at Launch School, it was a full-time job for I think some people are in that program for several years, but they try to get you to really understand enough of the fundamentals that you can solve all the problems that you will encounter going forward. And that's really what I needed because I was not there to try to like quickly get a job. I was like, I'm going to do this solo for the next extended period of time. I need to have enough. So I took my time. I went slowly, and I got a place at WeWork here in Hong Kong, and was in the office every day, not in a suit, but in my yoga pants and or yoga shorts and shirt, feeling very comfortable, but going through their curriculum and learning. So even after I quit, it was another 8 months before I wrote a single line of code for Hack Chinese. Um, yeah, but
Did you Okay, so one question I have, I want to get into the learning stuff too, because that's a pretty fascinating process because you basically self-taught like everything. Um, a lot of people I know that come from finance backgrounds or business backgrounds, I mean, you're a little bit different because you'd studied computer science and had had a job in at Galatea and things like that. But so you had become a banker, and it seems like there's two possible routes you could have taken. One is you raise money, and you go and hire employees. You get them to do a lot of the engineering. That saves you the trouble of having to kind of ramp yourself up on all of your software engineering skills. Uh, you don't have to learn design. It seems like a much more straightforward path to
Smarter
have
path.
taken to have taken that approach. So, given that you decided to kind of learn everything, why did you do that? Uh,
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So before I quit, I definitely considered, especially when when I had the full time job and the salary, I probably could have funded people to create this for me. Um, there was a number of reasons I didn't do that, and I guess the largest one was I would completely miss out on the learning aspect, right? So if I funded Hack Chinese, yeah, I'm not sure how that would have gone in terms of hiring other people to build your dream kind of thing. I know that happens a lot and people do it, but I've heard some of the horror stories of like, oh, the engineers like didn't they cut corners or whatever, and I didn't even know any of the languages that I would have proposed that they use or whatever. So like it would have been quite a challenge, and building a language learning app, which is absolutely no guarantee of success. So I was like, well, what if I spend a good chunk of money and funding people to build this thing that doesn't end up working? What will I have gained? Not very
hmm.
much. I will have gained the experience of having a frustrating experience and losing lots of money. Whereas if I did do it myself, I could kind of save that money. Um, Although the opportunity cost of not having a full-time job at the time obviously outweighs that a bit. But worst case scenario is I learn all of these things, right? So even if Hack Chinese was a complete commercial failure in the end, I still would have learned all of that stuff. On top of that, if it wasn't and it was going well and I wanted to continue it, now I could make those improvements myself. Oh, I have an idea for a feature, I can implement that, as opposed to if I had an idea for a feature for an app that somebody else had created for me, I then have to fund that again, I guess. And you just have to keep doing it, and you'd have no other way. And like once there's this like code base, and if you're not familiar with it, I think that would be much more challenging. Right around the time I quit, there were I had opportunity to raise cash. I wouldn't say it was a formal offer, but I had a couple people from work, a couple other people I had worked with related to Chinese language or whatever who were willing to basically put in some cash in return for some equity. But because I was lucky enough that I didn't need it, I saw no reason to do that. I mean, I think that if I were to do that, maybe closer to maybe this stage of the business would make more sense because okay, I have a product. It has revenues and costs, and it has like you know it's a thing that actually exists, and now we can value like, oh, do I want to move faster by hiring 2 engineers? It'll cost me X. I think that'll is worth roughly this much equity. Like that, those conversations make sense. Whereas in the beginning, it was like it just didn't. I wouldn't know how to deploy that capital in a meaningful way. That in the beginning, when I knew that I really wanted to be the one at least writing like the basics of all the main structures in terms of the engineering, right? So yeah.
So then, as your okay, so you make this choice, and then what does the learning process look like? Because I know you did at least two boot camps, right? One was for marketing, one was for software engineering. At some point, you learned design as well. So how was the process of learning all of those things, and then also the transition from you like walking into work every day with a suit, someone is giving you your assignments, now you have to manage yourself, you also have like a whole lot of stuff to learn. What was the transition like?
So the learning was at least so the launch school was the majority of my learning, and that was a formal thing. It's an online, it's a boot camp, but it's online, and so I was, going to the office every day, like you mentioned, and just sort of sitting down and going through their curriculum. That was the majority. I mean, the vast majority of the like official formal learning. Uh, that was fine. I felt especially right after right after I left State Street, the very next day I went to my new office and was not in the suit, was not in that felt wonderful. Just being able to like get to have your coffee and like not that I ever felt like, oh guys, my managers are looking for me. When am I coming in? Of course, that never really existed, but it was still kind of nice to just like here I am, like I'm doing what I want, like I can, I'm gonna go to lunch when I want, I'm gonna leave when I want. Like there was definitely a nice sense of kind of like accomplishment, even though I had done nothing yet other than quit. Like whoop-de-hoo, like how important. But like it was still like having made that decision felt very good in the beginning. And first very in the very beginning, I wasn't yet trying to build a business. I was just learning, so there was no like financial pressures at that time and all that sort of stuff. So that was quite easy. The the marketing side, so the General Assembly here in Hong Kong had a 12-week boot camp, and that was like, I think it was once or twice a week for a couple hours. It'd go at night, and you'd learn some of the broad themes of marketing. And this was really extremely high level, and I think afterwards I've actually found online videos or other resources that I think were more useful, but it was still good to get a lay of the land. Like, I had no idea that of the different channel types: paid, earned, owned, the different, the main paid channels, Google and Facebook, are actually very different. They have very different intent and all that. Like, it was good to get a broad overview of that stuff, but not because I could really take much action on what I learned there, but it like helped me understand later on, like the areas I wanted to focus on and learn a lot more on. Um, yeah.
If you had to go back now, so how long have you been working on Hack Chinese at this point, from start to now?
From actually writing the first line of code,
Correct.
uh,
Yeah.
3 years. Yeah.
3 years. If you had to look back on this, would you have changed the way you learned anything, whether it be what you decided to learn, how you learned it, the mix of things you learned? Anything you'd change about that?
If you ask that same question about the business trajectory and decisions I've made there, I would say a ton of stuff. But in terms of the learning, I I actually think I did it in a way that suits me and was quite useful. So learning, I certainly did not need to learn as much up front. I could have had a much more focused 12-week boot camp somewhere and learned to like, okay, write a small Rails app. And I think that probably, maybe that would have gotten me off the ground faster. I would have gone from zero to something a little bit faster. But taking the time to really like know enough about, like I learned quite a lot about databases. I learned quite a lot about like HTML and the DOM, and like, yeah, you can do like a 4-hour course on HTML and the DOM, and that'll be fine. But that only means you're postponing some of that learning until later, because then you have to, then you realize like, okay, well, what about like, the canvas, and how does jQuery interact with it, and like how do all these other, frameworks change things in the DOM, and like what is the HTTP cycle between the server and the client and all that sort of stuff. Like, you don't need to learn all of that stuff right at once. You can have a more targeted approach and just sort of like build an app, which I think is the more common accepted way that people think you should do that. And for many people, maybe that is, if you're really pressed for time, I guess. But for me, getting that broad understanding meant that later on, whenever I had any sort of like issue or trouble where I had some problem to solve, I may not know how to solve that, but I had like a really good framework of like understanding all the stuff around it. So I like knew where to look. I knew what types of questions to ask. I knew like I could narrow down the problem of like, oh, this is not working, and it can be one of 3 or 4 things. That came from this really like broad understanding that came from this more like mastery based curriculum. Sounds like an ad for launch school now, but for me that was the right thing to do. I had the luxury of a little bit of extra time I could spend on it, but going slow in the beginning, I think, sped me up in the end. So I would say technically that was the right path for me.
Hmm. Okay, so you mentioned on the business. If you thought about it from a business decision perspective, you've done things a little bit differently. So do you want to expand on that a little bit?
Sure. So 2018, I finished my formal learning and started writing code, and I was here in Hong Kong and started started building a Rails app, a Ruby on Rails app, and I spent maybe 6 months really just building, and that's probably more than most people say, oh, like get an MVP out like right away. The problem with getting an MVP out right away for this particular app was that you know, how many, like, at its true essence, what is HackChinese today? You could call it a flashcard app for Mandarin characters, Mandarin words. You could call it that. That's not wrong. That's essentially right. And so if I created an MVP of that, there's millions of those in the market. I mean, well, maybe not millions, but like there are so many like basic things like that, which are basically MVPs that they call finished products and put on the App Store. And so my idea was not really that, like the special sauce was not in that like MVP nature of it. It was kind of in the taking it to the next level of like ease of use and sort of like reduced time to administer. And so I needed to spend a little bit of extra time getting this product off the ground, and it was my first time ever doing it. So I spent a good amount of time getting it online, maybe 4 to 6 months, until it was like a usable thing halfway through 2018. And that was fine. I think that was the right way to do it. I then started like beta testing with a few people here in Hong Kong. I reached out to a couple different schools, said, hey, I have this product. Do you want to do you have any like teachers or students that could use it? And I got some responses. And I actually also went to a couple schools and like demoed what I had with them and thought like, oh, hey, we could maybe we could partner up, because like I had not tried to market this yet. And so I was thinking like, well, like a lot of these schools here in Hong Kong have already done some of that marketing. They've already attracted an audience. They have lots of people, students who might find this tool interesting. So maybe like we could share the wealth in a way. Like I've created a thing that could be useful to your students. Is there some way we could cross promote it, whatever? And there was some interest there with a couple different schools. And we'll come back to that in a big way the following year. But so then I officially launched at the very end of maybe November 1st, 2018 is like when we like launched. And that launch was what I call a psychological launch, because like it didn't mean anything. The payment gateway was already online. The software didn't change from one night to the next. Like there's no big difference. But in my mind, it was like, okay, I'm launching. I'm going to like make an announcement. Like this thing is live. Let's see what happens. 2018. And at the time, I naively ran ads. I don't say naively meaning ads were a bad idea, but because I didn't really know how to do ads that well, and spent a couple $1,000 US in a couple weeks. Got a lot of traffic to the site, got a lot of signups to the site. I got maybe like a few activations, meaning like people actually studied a thing, and no purchases. So then it was like coming to the end of December, and I was like, wow, like I quit my job a year and a half ago. I've been working on this tool for 1 year. I've spent a bunch of money on advertising and getting people to the site, and nobody has paid me $1 for it, basically. That was a very scary time. It was fortunately it was like early enough in the cycle of things that I was like, okay, like I can change directions now. I can pivot or whatever, and no big deal. Like obviously no business goes exactly how you plan it. One phrase I like is no business plan survives its first pass of the market, or something like that. I don't know. And okay, so that was not a happy time, but it was like, hey, I don't know anything about ads. I ran some ads that were probably poorly targeted. I didn't have an audience or whatever. So I made a decision at that point, which I can't say I regret that decision because I learned a lot from it, but I wouldn't make that decision again. And what that decision was, so then in 2019, the very beginning of 2019, I pivoted from I'm no longer going to be marketing this thing and focusing my energies and efforts towards individuals because my 2-week naive Google ad experiment completely failed. Instead, I'm going to be focusing on institutions. I'm going to try to white label this thing and sell it to schools. And that's going to be how HackChinese is going to grow. So 2019 was a very interesting year because I made a physical mailing. How weird is that for a digital tool? I made a physical mailing, made a pamphlet. I actually have it. I'll show it to you. Let's see here. I spent the time to make a really nice physical mailing. This is a couple years old now, but enhance
That's
your
awesome.
school with HackChinese. And see if I can. I won't go through this, of course, but you can see I definitely spent a good amount of time
This is like
making this.
beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, I spent a long time trying to make this awesome. Note that it's in English and going to school owners who are predominantly in Chinese speakers. So many mistakes here. Anyway, mailed this to about 30 or 20 schools in Hong Kong, um, and said, and the very last page was like, interested in like learning more, like sign up with this QR code and you'll get my SavvyCal link or whatever, and we can set up a time to meet. I got no responses from that, and so that was the culmination of like a lot of work. And so now I had two kind of like failures under my belt. I was like, well, I tried individuals, some customers, doing some Google ads, and that didn't work. And I tried to reach out to schools, and that didn't really work. But I did continue to reach out to schools anyway. I had some experience, like I had some relationships because I had originally been to all these schools myself as a student. So I used some of those to get into one school and had a lot of conversations. And there were two or three other schools. In the end, I was talking to four schools with some regularity here in Hong Kong. And I went to these places and I demoed HackChinese and showed it to them and showed them the great benefits of what they could get for their students and all of that. And there was enough interest and motivation from those schools that I continued down that path. And with one of those schools, we actually even white labeled the software, put it on their domain, advertised to their list. But in the end, all their students were like 14 years old or younger. And so spaced repetition, being like an honor system-based quizzing method, didn't really work for them. And so long story short, I spent 2019 chasing institutions and tons of learning. Both technically, I learned how to white label HackChinese. That infrastructure is still there if we ever do it in the future. And I was literally doing door-to-door sales, something I had never done before as a software engineer, my previous job. Or even at State Street, I was literally like showing up to these schools in Hong Kong with my laptop and being like, so here, like I was doing sales calls, which was like nothing I had ever done before, tons of learning. But at the end of 2019, I still had not made, I think I had sold 10, 15 something subscriptions or something like that. It was not a business at the time, not a functioning business.
So this is basically 2 years down the line. So 2018, 2019.
Yep.
And you have two pretty big setbacks. So one was the first wave of advertising to or targeting individual users doesn't work. Then you go the school's route. That doesn't really work. That's 2 years in.
Yep.
How do you feel about that at that time?
Miserable. I remember I went home, I flew home at the end of 2019, and I bawled my eyes out to my parents. I was like, what am I doing with my life? What did I give up? Why am I chasing this? Whether even though what I said was true, like there are learnings there, and that was not incorrect. I had learned a ton, and I'm probably more employable now than I ever have been because I now understand a lot in several different industries, and these are employable skills. So like all those things are good, but like how did I feel? I felt terrible. I felt like, geez, like the all the money's been going out for the last couple of years and not really coming in. So it was definitely a low point on the journey, but there were a few glimmers of hope as well, and one of them was one of them, which I guess you have to have. It doesn't count for much because it's me, but at least there was this, which was I felt the tool at the time was still the best in terms of what it did, and then also some of the beta testers who had been using it now for a year or a year and a half in some cases still used it every single day and said great things about it. So I was like, there's something here. I just haven't hit it. And so I went home. I had my first real long break from it, maybe 3 or 4 weeks. I traveled to see some of my friends in the U.S. in various cities and gave myself a nice break. And I decided that I'm going to give myself one more year. I'm gonna give myself one more year, and I'm going to refocus on. So the original question was, what would I do differently business-wise? And so I, in the start, created a tool which was meant for students. And the reason I did that was because I understand that particular problem very intimately. I had that problem myself, and I had tried a lot of the competitor tools and had always felt like there was a lot of room for improvement in various, across multiple areas. So that's what I had built. And then, because of a very short attempt at Google advertising and an early setback in that domain, I switched gears and I tried to sell to schools. But schools are, business owners who have a completely different set of priorities. They're not the learners. They're not the ones who really see the value from the tool. I don't know what their day-to-day concerns are. And so that was an enormous challenge. So trying to sell anything to anybody, even if it is the best thing that would be awesome for them, is hard. When you add on the fact that now there's this new layer of like, oh, I don't really know what your day-to-day problems are. Like, if you're a school owner, like, what do you really care about day-to-day? I don't really know. I've never been in that situation. So I decided that was not the right path. So I'm going to refocus on students, and I'm going to give it another year and really double down on that. So when I was home, I still on my like break from the coding, development, marketing side, I did some research on I read a bunch of books on my favorite books were product-led development, which was like basically said, if the product is awesome enough in certain ways, like that does a lot of them, that can carry a lot of the marketing weight for you. And one of the coolest parts from that book was I can't remember if this is actually that book or another book that I liked called Hooked, which was how to build. I think it was called How to Build Addictive Products or something like that. A lot of lessons from those two things, but one of the things that stood out to me was Facebook has a team of dozens and dozens and dozens of engineers. Maybe it's even hundreds of engineers, and their sole responsibility is your first 3 minutes on Facebook as a new user. And they're and so basically I signed up to Facebook 10 years ago, 15 years, I don't know, forever ago. I don't know what it's like being a new user, but apparently if you start today, the interface is simplified. There's not all these options. They immediately try to do all these things that will push you along the path of understanding the value of the tool. So in Facebook's case, maybe that means seeing your friends right away from whatever methods they use, scraping your contacts, whatever, getting you as quickly as possible to those moments of value. So then I looked back at HackChinese and I realized at that point, at the end of 2019, if you had found the page and signed up, you were put at the dashboard. There was no lists that were added to your account. There was no questions asking you what you had done before. All the functionality that is there today was largely there then, but there was just no hand-holding at all. So I ended up signing up for a bunch of various tools and figuring out what they did and copying what they did in terms of video onboarding or making the sign up flow as absolutely friction free as possible, not asking for more than just your email. I ended up having a questionnaire now that asks what was your study history, and my onboarding questionnaire has something like 600 questions in it, but most people usually see about 4 because it's a very tight process where it's if you ask this question and you've done this, we're going to show you these things. If you've done this, we're going to show you these 3 questions and then you're done. And we set up your account in a very good way. And then we push you. We don't even say, okay, now you could study if you want. It pushes you into, and immediately you're studying. You get pushed into a 2-minute study session. And that study session, you actually can't even make a 2-minute study session on HackChinese. 3 minutes is usually the smallest, but in the first one, just 2 minutes. And normally when you're learning something, you have to see something a certain amount of times before we assume that you know it. But for that one session and the next 2 only in your whole life of using HackChinese, the requirements for when you're learning something are actually shrunken a little bit. All these things that happen behind the scenes, you can see I'm kind of lighting up now because this was so much fun to dive into. I loved this process of it because it was it almost seems like hacking the psychology of people in a way, right? I'm not doing something bad. I'm trying to get them to understand the value. And if there is value there, which I believe there was, I just had to show it to them. So I spent 2 or 3 months redesigning the onboarding flow, setting up email sequences to people that are showing them tips in the beginning, all sorts of stuff. And then on the marketing side, I said, I think I chatted with you about this at one other point. I was like, if Google Ads is something that I could learn, no doubt about it. But I want to focus on this other stuff. And this is my last year. This is my Hail Mary pass. I'm gonna pay a firm to like run my ads. I went with like the best firm that I could find to like do these ads. I took a 24-hour course first, so I'd have like a good idea of like what they were doing. Paid for them to start doing it. We had a series of meetings, and we started trying several campaigns and sort of growing in that way. And yeah, and 2020 was awesome. So it was certainly not it wasn't like I had so much business that I'm now like totally out of the woods, and Hack Chinese is gonna be is guaranteed to be a success. But customer sentiment is high. Sales month over month are more every single month, and retention is very high. Churn, which is the same thing, churn is very low. And at this point, all my development is based on user requests, which are like, oh, this is great, but I need this, or this would be really good. And so if I hear something enough times, that's what we build in. So, yeah, so that's how we transition to the final stage. So now I feel like it's going to continue to be a B2C tool, something that individual students who totally get, who appreciate all of the value, that's who we're going to market towards, as opposed to institutions.
Yeah, I remember when I reached out to you. So for context for the audience, so I reached out to Daniel because I actually saw, I think, one of your paid ads, and I went on it, and I was very surprised because I was thinking, this tool looks good. Like the landing page looks good, which is shocking for me because every other tool I saw was like looked like it had been designed 20 years ago or something. And I think one of the things that I appreciated is like what I would call almost like this craftsman's approach to building products. So the point you made about the MVP, for example, that you didn't take this approach of like just ship something as quickly as possible. That is like by far, in my opinion, it's like a very dominant kind of mantra in the tech community. And it's also interesting to see that for a product like this, everyone's like, what's your one-line pitch? It's like, okay, spaced repetition software for learning Chinese or flashcards for Chinese. If you say any of these things, it's like, I think the reaction, especially as someone that's kind of like tried a bunch of these tools, is like, okay, whatever. It's like there's tons of those. But I mentioned this to you at one point, which was like Hack Chinese has a bunch of these like 2-3% improvements on anything else that exists. And then when you keep adding them up, they create like a very different experience around learning Chinese. So, obviously I'm a big fan because I wrote about your software. I've referred several customers to it. But I think even part of this interview that was interesting for me is like you just have a bit of a different view on building these things, which is not as rushed. It takes into account some of the softer details that you can't like economically justify right away. And I think there's a whole class of products that I've started to think about that kind of fall into this category, which is like when it's done right, you just know like it works. But getting to that point, I found is really difficult and requires a lot of intuition because it's not the kind of thing you can like. I think for some of the features, it's kind of you can ask your users, but I feel like there's a whole set. Correct me if I'm wrong on this, but like my feeling with Hack Chinese was that you had intuition about a lot of features that if you just poll people asking them what they want, it doesn't necessarily come out. So I'm not sure if I'm assuming that, but what do you think of that in general? Like of the features you built for Hack Chinese, how much of it was intuition for you? How much of it was listening to your users? And like, how do you think about when to listen to your users, when to follow your intuition?
Yeah, definitely, definitely what you said. When I told people, oh, I'm going to be building a space repetition tool for Chinese, you're leaving your like your career to build something that exists like a million times over. Like that's crazy. You're right. It's it was a challenge. So I think to me, one of the things that I had going for me, and I definitely recommend if you look for this, as a starting point, if you're looking to build any product, is are you somebody who has that pain point? I see oftentimes people in different forums or whatever say like, I'm looking to build a startup. I'll be, or whatever. Are there any problems out there that need solving? And it's like, good luck. This is so hard. This is so incredibly hard. If you're not solving a problem that you don't have, that you can't immediately feel like the visceral, like, this is annoying, how are you going to drive that development? What are you going to build? Are you going to listen to like other people? Like, maybe that works. I'm sure it does in times, but for me, that was, I mean, that has carried me at least 50%, if not significantly more of the way from getting this thing off the ground was I had a issue. I needed it solved. Nothing out there was solving it for me in the way that I wanted it to. So that was important. Um, I do listen to customers a lot in terms of the direction of something. Some things are very easy. If a customer says like, "Oh, my school uses this textbook. Can you get it online?" That's a no-brainer. Of course, yes, we can. Other times, some customers, some students have requests that are I would put them in the category of like the Microsoft approach, which is maybe the Microsoft from like the 90s or the 2000s approach, which was like, oh, like I can see that this thing works in this way. It would be cool if I could also do it these 8 other ways. And I don't think it's always wrong to add the options to do certain things as like maybe like an advanced feature here or there. But um, I think that if you can narrow down the options for any particular question you might have or way you might configure something to like two, to one is best. If there's a best practice and it's the dominant choice all of the time, don't even give the other options. If there's maybe a reason they might want to do one or two other things, you can add those in. But uh, complexity is one of the main reasons. So one of the main tools that is kind of a competitor, Anki. That's used all over the place to learn almost anything. They have a 140-page user guide, and so hey, they're incredibly successful. They have a better business than HackChinese at the point. I'm not saying anything bad about them. Um, I've used them a lot in the past, but I think there is a market for people who are not willing to go through that learning curve and just want best practices given to them. Um, one of the if I think most of the people these days who create Chinese learning, I'm not sure what the word is, but what they will create is a resource. Like here is content that you can study somehow. Like here are either some videos or some grammar patterns or lists of things that you can learn, um, or ideas on how you should be studying, all that sort of stuff. That's all awesome. I love all that stuff. I enjoy reading those things, but not everybody does. They just want progress. They just want like the best cases handed to them on a silver platter and are willing to pay for it. And so that's a thing I try to keep in my mind when I'm figuring out what direction to build HackChinese in. Like, sure, you could go read about like the optimal order to learn this, then that, then these things or whatever, and that's all cool. But if you miss that article and you don't do it in that way, or even if you do want to, how much time do you have to spend managing that whole process? That tool Anki, they have spent so much time making sure their algorithm is like algorithmically perfect, in like really, really high quality. Like they're probably incredibly, incredibly efficient. Like you will see this review exactly when you should, not a moment too soon, not a moment too late. Our algorithm is probably not as good as that. Unquestionably, it's not as good as that. And where we focus our time instead are on all the other like sort of polish of the tool, of making it easy to start, making it as little, hopefully zero management time as possible. Whereas with some of the more advanced tools, you need to really you need like a master's degree to like figure out how to get all the value from it. Whereas like, okay, maybe we are 90% as efficient as those, but almost everyone's going to be at that 90% efficiency all the time without any thinking, because we're doing all the math for you. You don't, we show you the statistics of why we show you stuff in HackChinese, but you don't even need to know or look or care. It's just going to happen if you just use it with some regularity. But our landing page right now, which I agree with it now, it says learn thousands of Chinese words this year, and that's really it. You don't also need to learn, other methods or like how to figure out how to manage your time or all this other stuff. It's like, no, just need to put like 10 minutes in a day, and by the end of the year, you'll have a pretty awesome vocabulary, which is like the one thing that we focus on at the moment.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, so Daniel, so here's the next question, getting to the kind of last part, I guess, of what I was hoping to talk about in this interview. So what's next for you? So, Hack Chinese 2020 is the year, like for you as well as the business. What's interesting to you moving forward, and how do you think about moving into the next couple of years or even next year, both personally and then on the business side of things?
There are I've been saying this for a while now, so maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like in terms of what I want Hack Chinese to do with the domain of stuff that it focuses on now, which is like the vocabulary, I feel like we're about 80% of the way there, with the exception of we don't have a native app yet. So there's still some work to do to get it to be a more well-rounded tool, more import options, more capabilities for students, more data views, quite a few more things there. But a large portion of that work is done. Then, of course, a native app at some point needs to come because although I always prefer desktop studying, I don't really like studying something on the phone because you're inherently in an environment that's terrible for studying if you're on your phone. Whereas if you're sitting down at a computer, I feel like it's better. Nonetheless, a lot of people want a native app, so that'll be coming at some point. Um, yeah, at some point, maybe a year from now, I'll need to make a decision of um, do I want to bring Hack Chinese to the next level uh, of a Chinese learning tool and expand it to beyond just the domain that it's in now. So right now it teaches Chinese words, and I think that was a very deliberate choice because vocabulary in any language, including Chinese, is one of the largest problems, and so any efficiencies you can gain in that area will have a big impact on all your other studies. So that was a great place to start. Plus, I loved spaced repetition, although I didn't like the way it was implemented. So that was the place to start. And at some point, I'll need to decide if I'm going to move that to the next level and try to tackle more of the language learning uh, pie or whatever. And my heart is kind of in that way. I think that there's so many areas that could use a different mindset when approaching how to create a tool. Um, and that could be another 10-hour podcast. I could go into ideas on how that might go. But I'm not the kind of person who wants to. I certainly won't let the tool just like linger or whatever. Like if I were to step away, I'd probably at least want to continue uh, working on it on myself or finding somebody else to work on it. But no doubt about it, I would certainly want to be occupied with my time. And I'm not just going to sit on a beach all the time and do nothing with my life. I very much want to be creating something. And my heart and passion right now is in Hack Chinese. I mean, it's a very exciting time. We just finished the best, the best year. These last 2 months were the best months. And hopefully that will continue business-wise, but also just talking to customers and all that. I can see how much difference it's making in people's lives, and that's super exciting in a way that I could not possibly have even predicted 4 years ago when I quit my previous job. So yeah, I hope I'm still working on Hack Chinese. I hope that we're creating better, more robust tools that make the whole process even easier if you want to learn Chinese. So.
Okay, well, very cool, Daniel. So, any final parting thoughts? Anything you wanted to share, or?
Uh, Gee, Thenuka, this was a lot of fun. I had a great time going back and thinking through all these. Some of these were very momentous times in my life, but I have not thought of them now because I am so stuck in the weeds day to day working on Hack Chinese. So it's been very fun to take a break and go back. And so thank you for that opportunity, not just today on this podcast, and probably the many thousands of people who will sit through 3 hours listening to my story, but also just the times I've had to chat with you in the past have been very something I value a lot. So I appreciate them.
Okay, awesome. Well, great, and thank you for taking the time, Daniel.
Great. Thank you.